Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, story lovers all over the world, to another episode of Never Lost, where we keep the old stories alive by retelling them for new audiences, so that they will never be forgotten. First of all, today, I'd like to thank everybody who is listening and all the people who have shown incredible early support for this new YouTube channel and podcast. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Steve from the excellent true crime podcast Murder of Crows for making the fabulous new intro that you just saw if you're watching this on YouTube. I'd encourage anybody interested in true crime to check out Murder of Crows because it's a fabulous podcast. So go look it up, and if you love it, which you should, then subscribe and become part of the Crow crew. So, today, I'm going to tell the story of the origins of Beira, the Winter Queen, and of her eventual defeat at the hands of her son Angus and his wife Bride, the King and Queen of Summer. So, without further ado, let's get straight into the tale of Beira, the Winter Queen. A lang, lang time ago, when there were fairies and brownies and kelpies and selkies, and magic still lived in the forests and moors of Scotland's hills and glens, the winter months were ruled by a goddess as powerful as she was frightening. Her name was Beira, and she was one of the oldest of the gods who inhabited ancient Scotland. In fact, much of Scotland's landscape had actually been formed by her hand or the hands of her 8 hag servants in the distant, distant past. Beira came to Scotland long before men set foot on these shores, when the land was desolate and almost featureless. She was there when the springs opened and rivers began to flow over the land. In her youth, if the first gods can be said to ever truly have been young, she made the mountains and valleys of Scotland with the help of her 8 hag servants. Like many gods, size was something that was entirely optional for the old gods of Scotland. They could appear as vast as the hills or manifest as small as any man or woman. When Beira was forming Scotland's landscape, she carried a great creel on her back. A creel was a large woven wicker basket, usually used for carrying goods to market. Beira's creel, though, was full of earth and boulders, which she piled high to form the mountains which Scotland is famous for, often helped by her 8 hag servants. Once she felt that a mountain was tall enough, Beira would use a magic black hammer to shape each peak into its unique form. If she struck the ground lightly with the hammer, then the moulded earth would become solid rock as hard as iron. If Beira struck the ground hard with the hammer, then a valley would open up. This is one of the things that I love most about mythological stories. People striving to explain why the world around them is the way it is or works the way it works. In the area of Easter Ross, in the Northern Highlands, there's a 1,000-metre high Munro called Ben Wyvis. A Munro is the name given to any mountain in Scotland which is more than 3,000 feet high. When Beira was making Ben Wyvis, she did all the work herself, the 8 hags being busy elsewhere performing tasks for the goddess. As she neared the end of her endeavour, she grew tired after many days of carting soil and rocks in the creel. She tripped as she approached Ben Wyvis and dropped her creel, and the earth and boulders it held spilled out and formed the smaller sister peak known as Little Wyvis. Beira made the mountains of Scotland for many reasons. One was as stepping stones to travel across the land. It was said she could go from one peak to another in a single leap. Another reason, or at least another use, was as homes, or prisons, depending on your view, for her giant sons. Beira had many children, and many of them were giants known as Fur. Beira did also give birth to gods and goddesses, but by far the most numerous of her children were the Fur giants. The Fur giants had many varied forms, some having many heads or arms, and others great antlers like deer. But whatever they looked like, all of the Fur giants were powerful, strong beings, said to be easily able to pick up and carry many cattle over their huge shoulders. which they carted off back to their mountain houses to roast for their dinners. The Four Giants were also all cantankerous and quarrelsome creatures, who fought constantly over who was the strongest, which is why Beira shut them up in the mountain prisons in the first place. This didn't stop the giant sons of Beira from fighting, though, and they would climb to the tops of their mountains at night and hurl boulders at each other. It is said that this is why Scotland's hills and glens have so many huge grey boulders littering the steep slopes and deep valleys of our landscape. When her work was finally finished and Scotland's rugged, mountainous landscape complete, Beira took great enjoyment from travelling the countryside from hilltop to hilltop, wandering the beautiful land that she had helped create. She was often accompanied or followed by animals who delighted in the world that she had made for them. Eagles soaring high overhead screeched to her, and mountain hares raced by her side. Beira also tended great herds and flocks on the hillsides. Deer and goats and the huge-horned Highland cows came at her command and enjoyed her protection. However, time moved on, and over hundreds of years the world changed in 100 small ways, and so did the aspect of Beira. In many ways, her power waned or diminished with the changes, though she was still feared and respected across the land. Beira's strength was drawn from the cold. It was sharp and pure, but merciless. Her 8 hag servants were all spirits of cold and ice, frost and snow. The greatest threat to Beira's dominion came from the advent of the seasons. As the sun waxed in strength and warmed the land, so Beira's hold on the land grew more tenuous. By the time men and women sparsely populated Scotland, there were many warm months where Beira's power held no sway over the land, and her aspect and character had changed considerably from what and who she had been. When people came to know her, Beira's power was so diminished by the warming sun and summer months that once every year she had to travel to the mystic Green Isle to drink from the well of youth which bubbled up from a spring on the hidden island. The Green Isle appears in many Scottish and Irish folk tales. It was a floating island hidden by a magical mist. Many sailors had seen it, but the Green Isle couldn't be found if you were looking for it. It appeared off the coasts of Ireland or close to the Hebridean Islands off the coast of Scotland. It was always summer on the Green Isle, and the trees were always full of fruits, and flowers always bloomed on its shores. The Green Isle's most notable feature, though, was the Well of Youth, the waters of which were most potent and powerful on the first of the lengthening days of spring. Beira would travel to the Green Isle the night before and await the first rays of sun on the first day of spring. Then she would drink the waters of the well, regaining her youth and strength. It was said that if a dog barked or a bird sang before Beira drank, then she would crumble to dust, since she was older than the hills. Throughout the seemingly short months of spring and summer in Scotland, Beira slept a magical and transformative sleep in her castle, hidden deep inside Ben Nevis, Scotland's highest Munro. When Beira woke from this magical slumber, she arose into the autumn sun as a young and beautiful maiden, cheeks as red as rowan berries and eyes that sparkled blue like the ocean. Her long yellow hair flowed down past her shoulders, and her skin was a healthy pink. At the beginning of autumn, Beira travelled Scotland, tending her wild flocks, dressed in a robe of deep green and a shawl of pure white, with a wreath of wildflowers around her head. However, as the weeks and months pass, Beira quickly reverts back to the relative age that she should be, and by the start of winter, although her powers haven't yet begun to fade, her visage is very different. She appears now as an old and withered crone, or caliach. Her hair is now thin and white as fresh snow. The wreath of wildflowers has withered and gone along with all the other blooms in the land. Her green robe has faded to a dusky, colourless grey, and her shawl is tattered, dirty, and covered in frost. Whether young or old, Beira is always seen wearing this great shawl. It was said that at the beginning of winter each year, Beira would travel to the waters between the western islands of Scarba and Jura to wash her shawl in the whirlpool known as Corrie Brecken. The whirlpool got its name after the son of a Scottish king called Brecon drowned in the pool. His great boat was capsized by the waves raised by Beira when she washed her shawl in the swirling waters. Once Beira was done washing the shawl, she shook it out over the mountains of Scotland, and the frost that was cast off it formed the first winter snows that covered the mountain tops. With the waning of her powers, Beira also became bitter and cruel as the north winds which lashed the land in the winter months. She came to embody everything that was harsh and merciless about winter. She resented her own aging and the lessening of her strength during the summer time. Beira, as I mentioned, had many children. Most numerous were the Fúor giants, but some were gods and goddesses like her. Her most loved son and soon to be most feared child was her finest and fairest, Angus the ever young. Angus was golden haired and blue eyed, as Beira herself had been in her youth. He was known as the handsomest of all the Scottish gods, and had a kindness and generosity of nature to match his fair looks. Angus had never much liked the cold domain that his mother so cherished. He loved growth and life and beauty, and so he made his home on the Green Isle, which shifted around in the Western Sea in a state of perpetual summer and plenty. He was well liked by the good king of the Green Isle, and lived there happily and contentedly for many, many years. Beira saw her son each year when she visited the Green Isle to drink from the waters of the Well of Youth, and watched him grow from a child into a fine young man, under the protection of the king of the Green Isle. However, one fateful year, Beira had a terrible premonition concerning Angus. It came to her in a dream on a cold winter's night, while she rested in her castle inside Ben Nevis. She saw her son as the king and master of summer, relishing in the warm times of plenty which the season brought, and married to a beautiful queen who was as powerful as he. His queen was more beautiful than Beira had ever been, even in her youth, and she saw the couple delight in the receding of snow and ice, and walking the green and fertile land as master and mistress of all that they surveyed. She saw the beautiful young girl put her hand on the frozen rivers and lochs of Scotland, and melt the ice that held them. Most importantly, Beira saw her own power and dominion finally broken, and herself relegated to little more than a memory in the land, while men and women, and even the animals who had once been her friends and allies, hailed Angus and his queen as the new rulers of Scotland's hills and glens. Beira was furious at the idea that her rule over the land, which she herself had fashioned long, long ago, might come to an end. She swore to herself that she would do everything within her still considerable powers to stop her premonition from coming to pass. The first thing she did was dispatch her 8 hag servants, the lesser Cailleach, to ride out and bring her the princess who she had seen in her vision. She said to the 8 hags, "Mount your goats and now go forth, ride east and west and south and north, search the country far and wide, and bring me the princess known as bride. I shall hold back the summer sun, so that she never meets Angus the ever young." The 8 hags did as their mistress bid. Mounted on their 8 large, shaggy-haired goats, they searched the hills and glens until they found the princess whose name was Bride, whose hair was golden as sunshine, and whose gentle smile was as warm as a summer's day. The 8 hags brought Bride to the castle of the Queen of Winter, hidden deep inside the mountain of Ben Nevis. Here, Beira kept the young woman prisoner. Jealous of Bride's great beauty, Beira gave her only rags to wear, and put her to work with the castle's other servants. The Queen of Winter treated Bride with contempt and cruelty, constantly belittling the young woman and finding fault with everything she did. Bride's days were spent in scornful sorrow, held captive by the Winter Queen. One day, Beira gave poor Bride a brown fleece and told her that she must wash the fleece in the freezing waters of a nearby river until it was clean and white as new-fallen snow. Bride took the brown fleece to a pool under a waterfall not far from Ben Nevis, and all day long she toiled, rubbing and washing the brown fleece until her hands were as cold as the waters of the icy river, and her fingers were raw from beating and scrubbing the fleece on the rocks. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't wash the brown colour out of the fleece. When Bride returned to the castle in the evening, Beira scolded the young woman. "You are a useless, foolish girl. The fleece is as brown as when I gave it to you." Close to tears, Bride protested. "All day long I washed the fleece in the pool below the waterfall of red rock. No amount of cleaning or scrubbing will turn a brown fleece white." Beira sneered at Bride as she said, "Tomorrow you will wash it again, and if you do not wash it white, then you shall go on washing it the next day, and the next day, and on every day after. Now be gone from my sight, you foolish girl." For many days Bride washed the fleece in the cold waters, but as she had said, no amount of washing can turn a brown fleece white. Then, one day, while she was scrubbing the fleece on the rocks by the waterfall, and weeping tears of sorrow at the futility of the task, and at the cruelty of Beira, an old man approached her from out of the trees. He was wearing a hooded robe, which was light grey in colour, but sparkled like hoar's frost in the sunlight. When he drew back the hood, his long hair and beard were the same grey, but his eyes twinkled like bright emeralds in his wrinkled face. The old man's voice was soft and gentle as he spoke. "Who are you, child, and why do you weep such sorrowful tears?" Wiping her eyes, Bride told the man who she was, and that she was a captive of Beira, who had ordered her to wash this brown fleece until it was purest white. The old man's green eyes grew sad, and he shook his head in pity for Bride. "I am truly sorry for your misfortune. Indeed, that sounds very much like the Winter Queen right enough. She has grown cruel and harsh over time, and has little room in her heart now for empathy or love. Give me the fleece, child, and I shall make it white for you." "But who are you?" asked Bride, as she handed the brown fleece to the old man. "My name is Father Winter," the old man said, "and I have known Beira far longer than you or any other mortal has lived." Bride was shocked. Father Winter was well known throughout the land. His true name was Bodach, and he had in fact been the husband of Beira many long years ago. But while Beira resented and rejected the changes that came with the turning of time, Bodach embraced them, and he lamented the cruel actions of his one-time wife. The old man shook the fleece 3 times in the air, and on the third shake the brown fleece turned purest white. Bride was overjoyed as the old man handed her the now white fleece. When she took it, he said, "Take also what I hold in my other hand, child." Bodach gave Bride a small bunch of shining white snowdrops, telling her, "If Beira scolds you, give her these flowers. If she asks where they came from, tell her they came from the green rustling fir woods. Tell her also that the cress is springing up on the banks of burns, and that new grass has begun to shoot up in the fields." With that, Father Winter turned and walked silently off into the trees, vanishing in moments. Bride returned to Beira's castle, and that evening she laid the now white fleece at the feet of the Winter Queen. However, Beira barely noticed the fleece. Her eyes were fixed on the bunch of snowdrops in Bride's other hand. As cold as the winds from the north, Beira asked, "Where, you foolish girl, did you get those flowers?" Bride, without meeting the Winter Queen's gaze, said, "The snowdrops are now growing in the green rustling fir woods. The cress is springing up on the banks of burns, and new grass has begun to shoot up in the fields." Beira was furious as she dismissed Bride. "Evil are the tidings you bring me, girl. Begone from my sight." Beira knew that if what Bride says was true, then her efforts to hold back the turning of the seasons were insufficient, and spring was creeping over the land. So Beira summoned her 8 hag servants again, and told them, "Ride north and south, ride east and west, to valley floor and mountain crest. Smite the world with ice and frost, until every blooming flower is lost. Let no budding plant survive, leave not a blade of grass alive. New growth shall be an act of treason. We now wage war against the seasons." The 8 hags mounted their shaggy-haired goats and rode across the land, bringing frost and tempest, killing new growth wherever they found it, and beating back the encroaching spring. At around the same time, on the mystic Green Isle, somewhere in the western seas, Angus the ever-young was oblivious to the actions of his malevolent mother. Oblivious, that is, until he too had a prophetic premonition. While he dozed under a grove of apple trees laden with fruits, Angus dreamt of a beautiful princess. In his vision he saw the lovely maiden bride as she knelt by a burn in a forest. Tears tumbled from the eyes of the gorgeous girl he had never met, and where they fell, violets sprang up from the ground. Her face had a look of heartfelt sorrow that touched Angus's heart and caused him to fall immediately in love with the princess in his dream. Behind Bride, in Angus's dream, stood an old man with a light grey robe and a long beard. The man's green eyes shone from under his hood as he looked with pity upon the sad, tearful girl. Angus asked the old man, "Who is this beautiful girl, and why does she weep so?" The old man answered, "Her name is Bride, and she weeps because she is held captive by Beira, who treats her cruelly, allowing her little freedom and no happiness." Angus looked again at Bride in her sorrow, and said, "I would set her free if I could. Tell me, old man, where I might find her." The old man smiled and seemed to wink with one of his emerald green eyes. Then Angus awoke beneath the apple trees on the Green Isle. Angus went to the King of the Green Isle for counsel and help in interpreting his dream. The king told the young god, "The fair princess that you dreamed of is Bride. In the days to come she will be your queen when you are the king of summer. Your mother Beira kens this full well, and it is her wish to keep you from meeting Bride, so that her own reign over the land may be prolonged. That is why she has imprisoned the girl in her castle. But neither man nor God can defeat the turning of time. Tarry here, young Angus, until the flowers begin to bloom again and grass begins to grow. Then you shall set free the princess and fulfill your and her destinies." Although Angus knew the King of the Green Isle to be wise and kind in all things, he was greatly troubled by the thought of his beloved bride living in sorrow while he lived in luxury on the Green Isle. He wanted to go at once to Scotland to find Bride and rescue her from the clutches of the Winter Queen. The King of the Green Isle counselled against rash action, saying to Angus, "Have a care, young Angus. It is still February, the wolf month, and always uncertain is the temper of the wolf. As time turns, Beira's powers will wane, and the natural winter months come to an end. When she is weaker, you may rescue your love safely." Angus, though, was impatient, and said, "Good king, I will search for her now. I shall cast a spell on the sea and a spell on the land, borrowing 3 days from August to find her." Angus did as he said he would, and took 3 days from August to search for Bride immediately. For 3 days the seas calmed, and the land was bathed in summer sun. Angus rode east on a great white steed given to him by the King of the Green Isle, and he looked all over the land for the Princess Bride who he had seen in his dream. It is said that during these 3 days of calm, while Angus rode across the land, an old bard caught sight of the young god and raised his harp and sang, "Angus has come, the young, the fair, the blue-eyed god with golden hair, the god who to the world doth bring this morn the promise of the spring, who moves the birds to song ere yet he hath awakened the violet, or the soft primrose upon the steep, while buds are laid in lidded sleep. White snows wrap the hills serene, ere glows the larch's vivid green. Through the dark brown woods all hail Angus, and may thy will prevail. He comes, he goes, and far and wide he searches for the Princess Bride." During all his 3 days of searching, Angus didn't find Bride. Beira, suspicious of the unseasonably warm weather, kept her captive, shut up tight in her castle. But inside Ben Nevis, Bride dreamt of Angus, riding his white steed all over the country, searching for her. When she woke up, she cried tears of joy at the thought that her captivity might come to an end, and whenever her tears fell on the slopes of Ben Nevis, violets sprang up, as blue as her beautiful eyes. Beira soon came to know that Angus was looking for Bride, and she raised a great tempest, which drove the young god back to the Green Isle. But Angus would not be so easily dissuaded. He had seen the violets on the slopes of Ben Nevis, and he returned again and again, searching for his beloved bride. Finally, the two would meet on the first day of spring in the woods on the slopes of Ben Nevis. Angus said to Bride from the saddle of his white horse, "Beautiful princess, I beheld you in a dream weeping tears of sorrow." Bride said, "Mighty prince, I beheld you in a dream, riding over the bens and glens in beauty and power, searching for me." Angus offered Bride his hand and said, "I have come to rescue you from Queen Beira, who has kept you all winter long in captivity. Today will be a day of great joy for all mankind ever after." This is why, to this day, in the Highlands, the first day of spring, the day on which Angus found his princess, is known as Bride's Day. As soon as Bride took Angus's hand, a host of fairies and lesser gods appeared from out of the forest. The great crowd of the Downie Sidhe all knelt before the couple and proclaimed them king and queen of summer. The fairy queen, de facto leader of the Downie Sidhe, waved her silver wand, and in an instant the rags that Bride was wearing were transformed into a shimmering gown of lightest green with spangles of shining silver. Over her breast, on a silver chain, hung a star-like crystal, pure as her thoughts and bright as the joy that Angus had brought her, and that she had helped bring the land. The gem was called the Guiding Star of Bride, and it shone as bright as the North Star in the shaded woodland. In Bride's right hand she now held a silver wand of her own, entwined with golden cornstalks. In her left she held a golden horn, called the Horn of Plenty. The first forest bird to hail Bride in her beauty was the linnet, and the queen of the Downie Sidhe said, "Ever after shall you be called the bird of Bride, and sing the coming of the spring." As the company made their way to the fairy queen's home near the coast, the first seabird to cry joy at the sight was the oyster catcher, and the queen of the Downie Sidhe said, "Ever after this shall you be called the page of Bride, and cry the coming of the spring." The fairy queen took Angus and Bride to her home under a great green mound. On the way, they came to a wide river frozen over with ice. Bride stepped forward, put her fingers on the surface of the frozen water, and immediately an ice hag shrieked in pain and fled north to her mistress. Inside the fairy palace, a great feast was held for Angus and Bride, and the two were married by the queen of the Downie Sidhe. The fairies danced and sang with joy, and all the land was moved to dance and sing with them. This was how the Festival of Bride came to be. People all over the land sang that spring had come and winter was finally over. Shepherds drove their flocks onto the moors, and farmers readied the ground for sowing and the planting of crops. When Angus and Bride came out of the fairy palace, it was as king and queen of summer. Bride waved her silver and gold wand, and Angus spoke spells of power, giving life and growth to plants and grass across the land. However, the ice hag which had been defeated had told Beira of the meeting of Angus and Bride, and she was furious when she found out. She was even more wroth when she beheld the grass growing across the land, responding to the will of the king and queen of summer. Beira knew that with the coming of the new spring, now that Angus and Bride had been united, her reign over the land would be over, and never again would she hold the same power over the land. Angus and Bride were now together, but Angus was still a young god, and Bride was still growing into her new powers. Beira was one of the first gods, and had still more than enough strength to challenge the couple. She called her 8 hag servants to her, and said, "Ride north and south, ride west and east, bring winter ice to man and beast. I shall ride against Angus the ever-young, and wage coldest war against my son." The 8 hags mounted their great shaggy goats, and brought terrible storms of ice and hail to all corners of the land. Beira herself mounted her great grey wolf, and with dark clouds of cold tempests following her, she rode to do battle with Angus and Bride. The Downie Sidhe fled in terror at the sight of the Winter Queen riding out with storm and ice at her heels. Angus saw his mother approach in her fury, and knew that now, young as he was, and with Bride but new to her powers, they were no match for mighty Beira. He lifted Bride onto his white horse, leapt onto its back behind her, and then the couple fled towards the safety of the Green Isle, with Beira chasing them all the way. Angus and Bride rode westwards in their flight, with Beira close behind. There is a rocky ravine on the island of Tiree off the west coast of Scotland. Angus's white horse jumped the wide gap and made 2 large gashes in the rocks. The wolf of Beira balked at the gap, refusing to risk the jump, and Angus and Bride made good their escape to the Green Isle. To this day, the ravine on Tiree is known as the Horse's Leap. Beira was beyond furious at the escape of Angus and Bride. She punished the land with the harshest winter weather that her powers could manifest. She smote the ground again and again with her hammer, freezing it as hard as iron and preventing any grass or flower from breaking through. She called on the coldest storms and tempests at her command to scour the land, tearing limb from tree and plant from cold soil. It was a time of great hardship over all of Scotland. Crops couldn't grow, and cattle were frozen on the hillsides. Many animals and people lost their lives to Beira's fury, as the land was plunged into the worst winter any had ever seen. Angus wept for the poor victims of his mother's anger, and tried again and again to return to Scotland to break Beira's hold on the land. Again and again he fought the 8 hags of Beira, and when he grew tired, Bride would bring him food and water from the Green Isle to replenish and rejuvenate the new King of Summer. As well as Bride, time was also on Angus's side. With every passing day, Beira and her 8 hags grew weaker, and he grew stronger, as spring fought to reassert itself over the land. Eventually, Angus was able to defeat the 8 hags of Beira and drive them to the distant north. However, Beira herself would not be so easily beaten. She called back the 8 hags and also all of her other servants and soldiers, including many of the Fúor giants who were also her children. She bid them all ride forth against Angus in a mighty host. Also, to try and trap the King of Summer and prevent him from fleeing back to the Green Isle, Beira recalled the 3 days of winter, which Angus had replaced with 3 days from August earlier, to search for Bride. These days came to Beira in the form of 3 spirits of terrible storms mounted on 3 huge black hogs. These storms were so severe that black cloud blocked out the sun, and hail and snow was so thick in the air that it was almost impossible to see anything through the tempests. Angus might have been lost in the terrible storms and fallen prey to Beira's trap, but from the shores of the Green Isle the guiding star of Bride shone brighter than the North Star. The crystal gem was still hung on a silver chain about the neck of Bride, and as she waited in vigil for the return of her beloved, its light penetrated even these awful storms and guided Angus back to safety on the Green Isle. The 3 days of these terrible storms were known as the 3 Hogs' Days in Scotland, and again many people and animals were the victims of Beira's misplaced fury. However, when the 3 Hog Days were over, warm sunshine broke the dark cloud and bathed the land in healing light. Beira shrieked in anger because she could not hold back the seasons any longer. She was aged now, well beyond even her years, and her weak and withered form was powerless against the coming of spring and summer. Angus and Bride rode east from the Green Isle back to Scotland on the day which is equal in length with the night. When she saw their coming, Beira fled north and didn't stop until she reached the Isle of Skye. Here she found brief rest on the summit of Ben Achilleach, the old wife's ben. At the top of the peak, Beira stared across the sea and wept tears of sorrow and rage at the loss of her powers and dominion. When night fell, she went west to drink from the waters of the Well of Youth and replenish herself. When Angus and Bride returned to Scotland's shores, it was as the King and Queen of Summer proper. They were hailed by all the Downie Sidhe and by men and women across the land, who rejoiced at the coming of new growth and the times of plenty that spring and summer bring with them. The great Cailleach Beira was not dead. Winter will always have a hold on Scotland for its proper season, but Beira would never again be as powerful as she was, and winter would never again seek to reign over Scotland for all time. After this, when Beira was seen in the winter months, it was as a mournful old hag, lamenting the loss of her youth and strength. She wandered the snowy hills singing a sad song, which I will read to you in the next episode. For now, though, that is the end of the tale of Beira and of Angus and Bride. Thank you so much for listening, and I very much hope to see you next story.